They claimed they were doing it for God. But when it was over, all that was left were bodies. Mothers torn from children. Streets soaked in blood. How does a religion that teaches peace and mercy get used to justify murder? How does a book that starts with the words, "In the name of God, the most merciful," end up in the hands of suicide bombers and kidnappers? This isn't just about Islam. It's about what happens when faith is twisted into extremism. This is the chilling story of how the Qur'an, a book sacred to over 1 billion people, was turned into a weapon, and the scars produced as a result. Before we go any further, let's clear something up. Islam is followed by over 2 billion people around the world. At its core, it's a religion built on peace, compassion, and submission to God. The Quran talks about mercy a lot, but just like how parts of the Bible were once used to justify slavery and war, the Quran has also been taken out of context, twisted to fit dangerous agendas. Groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, they don't speak for Islam. They speak for power, for control, and for fear, using religion as a cover. But what happens when people believe those lies? Let's take one of the most misused verses. Kill them wherever you find them. Chapter 2, verse 191 of the Quran. Sounds terrifying, right? But here's the thing. That's only part of the verse. The full context is about self-defense. Back then, Muslims were under attack in Mecca. The verse actually starts by saying, "Fight in the way of Allah, those who fight you, but do not go beyond the limits. Allah does not love those who go too far." Chapter 2, verse 190 of the Quran. In plain terms, defend yourself if you're attacked, but don't start a fight. Don't harm innocent people. Stay within limits. But extremists, they cut out that part. They only quote what serves their narrative. To them, war is holy. Killing becomes a religious act. Let's go back to 2001. When Osama bin Laden carried out the 9/11 attacks, he claimed he had permission from God. In his public statements, he quoted several verses from the Quran, using them to justify the deaths of over 3,000 innocent people. One of those verses was, "Prepare against them whatever power you can." Chapter 8, verse 60 of the Quran. This verse came during a time of war, when Muslims were defending themselves from being wiped out. But bin Laden used it to justify training suicide bombers. The very next verse says, "But if they lean toward peace, then you should also lean toward it." Chapter 8, verse 61 of the Quran. Did he mention that part? Of course not. In his version of Islam, peace is weakness, mercy is betrayal, and martyrdom means blowing yourself up in a crowd. Now let's see what happens when this kind of thinking spreads. Take Boko Haram in Nigeria. In 2014, they kidnapped 276 schoolgirls from a village called Chibok. Why? Because they said Western education is a sin. They even quoted religious texts to argue that girls shouldn't go to school, something the Prophet Muhammad himself encouraged. They raped those girls. They forced them into marriages. And through it all, religious chants played in the background. That's not religion. That's terrorism wrapped in holy words. Now look at ISIS in Iraq and Syria. In 2014, they claimed they were restoring a caliphate. But what they really did was horrifying. Mass executions, throwing people off rooftops, even burning people alive. To justify this, they quoted, "The punishment of those who wage war against Allah is execution or crucifixion." Chapter 5, verse 33 of the Quran. But again, this verse was about punishing armed criminals during tribal wars. It wasn't a license to burn prisoners alive or kill children on camera. That's the danger of twisting scripture. It turns guidance into a weapon. Here's something a lot of people don't realize. Suicide is strictly forbidden in Islam. The Quran says, "Do not kill yourselves. Indeed, God is merciful to you." Chapter 4, verse 29 of the Quran. But in some places, Palestine, Afghanistan, and others, suicide bombers are seen as heroes. They're promised paradise. Extremist teachers claim it's not suicide, but sacrifice, that it's for the greater good. But Islamic scholars around the world completely reject this idea. They say martyrdom means standing your ground in battle, not blowing up a market full of children and mothers. Extremists don't just fight with bombs and bullets. They fight with ideas. They run schools, camps, indoctrination centers, where boys as young as 5 are taught violent versions of the Quran. In places like Pakistan's tribal areas, Somalia, and northern Nigeria, children grow up believing that killing unbelievers is a good thing. that wearing a suicide vest is not death, but a ticket to heaven. These kids don't know the real Qur'an. They only know what warlords and terrorists want them to believe. It usually starts with one line, a favorite of extremists: kill the polytheists wherever you find them. Chapter 9, verse 5 of the Qur'an. At first glance, it sounds brutal. But here's the truth. This verse was revealed in the middle of a 7th century war. It was never a general command. It was a specific instruction during a specific battle. The Muslim community at the time was under attack. But today's extremists, they ignore all that context. They treat this line like a blanket order, like God gave them permission to kill anyone who disagrees with them. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, as governments collapsed and wars tore through Muslim countries, a new version of Islam began to rise, one shaped more by politics and pain than actual faith. Western colonialism, foreign invasions, corrupt dictators, all left behind chaos. And in that chaos, radical leaders stepped in. They found boys in religious schools, kids who memorized scripture but didn't really understand it. And they filled their heads with hate. They tell them, unbelievers are your enemy. The Quran says you must strike first. But they don't talk about chapter 5, verse 32 Quran, which says, whoever kills a soul, it's as if they've killed all of humanity. Or Quran 68, which teaches kindness and justice toward peaceful people. The extremists skip those parts. They focus only on the violent lines, rip them from history, and burn them into angry minds. In 1965, Indonesia saw one of the worst massacres in modern history. Nearly 1 million people were killed in an anti-communist purge. Some religious leaders helped justify it by labeling the victims enemies of God. In 1994, during the Rwandan genocide, some Islamic leaders used Quranic verses to push ethnic hatred. Mosques turned into killing grounds. Passages about struggle were twisted into calls for slaughter. In 2014, ISIS attacked the Yazidi people in Iraq. They killed men, enslaved women, and took children from their families. They quoted hadiths and verses from the Quran to justify it, claiming it was all part of the Prophet's tradition. Still, not everyone stayed silent. Respected Muslim scholars, like Tariq Ramadan, Sheikh Abdallah bin Baya, and Fethullah Gulen, have spoken out boldly. They've issued fatwas, published papers, and given speeches making it clear terrorism has no place in real Islam. They point out that the Quran forbids hurting innocent people. Even in war, Muslims are commanded to protect women, children, the elderly, and even trees. But extremists don't care about that. They care about power. And for them, power comes through fear and bloodshed. And now, the battlefield has shifted online. On YouTube, radical clerics post videos with dramatic editing and fiery speeches, quoting verses out of context. On Telegram, secret groups share bomb-making guides right next to cherry-picked scripture. Some are now even using AI-generated avatars to preach hate, with fake voices and faces, spreading lies faster than ever. This new form of propaganda doesn't just speak Arabic, it speaks emotion, anger, pain, betrayal, and it still hides behind verses. Verses used like weapons, not wisdom. But there is hope. There is resistance. In countries like Morocco, Malaysia, and Jordan, Islamic schools are being reformed. Instead of just memorizing the Quran, students are taught to think critically, to understand the meaning, context, and history behind the verses. There are movements like Not in Our Name, where Muslims around the world publicly reject violence in the name of Islam. And most powerful of all, the voices of survivors. Former extremists who now help others leave that life behind. Mothers who lost sons to radical groups. Imams who risk their lives to speak the truth. They're all sending a clear message. If your religion tells you to kill innocent people, it's no longer religion. It's just madness. Here's the hard truth. The Quran can be misunderstood, just like any ancient text. The same verse that one man uses for violence, another might use to bring peace. The difference? It depends on who's reading it, who's speaking it, and whether they're holding a microphone or a knife. Even state actors have twisted scripture into policy. In Saudi Arabia, under decades of Wahhabi rule, a narrow and rigid interpretation of Islam justified everything from public beheadings to the stoning of women. The state banned churches, executed sorcerers, imposed brutal corporal punishments, all while invoking the name of God and citing Quranic law. Religious police roamed the streets with whips, teenagers were lashed for dancing at house parties, books were banned, music silenced, girls denied education. And behind it all was a belief that this was pure Islam, uncorrupted by time or culture. But was it? Or was it simply a case of power disguised as piety? And then there's Pakistan. The blasphemy laws in Pakistan are among the most dangerous tools of religious violence in the modern world. Just an accusation that someone insulted the Prophet can lead to lynching, imprisonment, or execution. In 2011, the governor of Punjab, Salman Taseer, was assassinated by his own bodyguard simply for defending a Christian woman accused of blasphemy. His killer was celebrated as a hero. Crowds showered him with rose petals. Mosques echoed with prayers for his martyrdom. And once again, verses were twisted, weaponized, turned into slogans. But what about the innocent? What about the men and women who loved Islam, who prayed 5 times a day, fasted during Ramadan, and lived peaceful lives, but were slaughtered anyway? In Afghanistan, Taliban fighters have bombed mosques where other Muslims gather, Shia Muslims, who they deem heretics. They've murdered schoolgirls, executed musicians, and hanged gay men from cranes, each time claiming it was their religious duty, each time quoting God. But the God they quote seems unfamiliar to most Muslims. He is not merciful, not compassionate, not just. He is vengeful, selective, bloodthirsty, and yet millions believe this is Islam. The real tragedy is that for every Quranic verse misused by extremists, there are dozens that preach peace. There is no compulsion in religion. Chapter 2, verse 256 of the Qur'an. If they incline to peace, then incline to it. Indeed, Allah loves those who act justly. Chapter 60, verse 8 of the Qur'an. But peace never makes headlines. Bombs do. Blood does. Screams do. And so the world keeps watching, confused, afraid, angry, while extremists carry out atrocities in the name of a God that billions worship in love, not fear. What happens next? That depends on who tells the story. If the voices of hate keep shouting louder than the voices of compassion, then the blood will keep flowing. But if people start asking questions, start learning the real history, the real meaning, the real Islam, then maybe the next generation won't be so easily fooled, because scripture is not a sword until someone chooses to sharpen it. Behind every terrorist who pulls the trigger, there's often a hand you don't see. Sometimes it's wearing a turban, other times a tailored suit, and sometimes a government badge. Because the story of Islamic extremism isn't just about angry preachers or misguided believers. It's also about power, money, strategy, control, and more often than we'd like to admit, it's about who benefits from the chaos. Let's rewind to the 1980s. Afghanistan. The Soviet Union invades, and the world watches a poor Muslim nation get swallowed by a superpower. But the United States doesn't just sit back. No, they pour billions of dollars into training and arming Islamic fighters, calling them freedom warriors. They even have a name, the Mujahideen. Sounds noble, right? Until you realize who was on that list of CIA-funded warriors. Osama bin Laden. Yes, the future architect of 9/11 once received direct support from the US under the banner of holy war. Why? Because they weren't interested in peace. They were interested in bleeding the Soviets dry. And Islamic extremism was the perfect tool. The CIA didn't just give these men guns, they gave them ideology. They helped distribute textbooks promoting jihad in Afghan schools. Children were taught math using bullets and Kalashnikovs. It worked. The Soviets withdrew. But what the US left behind was a Frankenstein monster. That monster mutated. After the Soviets left, those same fighters needed a new cause, a new enemy. And what's more unifying than God? The old training camps were reborn under different flags, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, and later ISIS. But the roots were planted by superpowers playing God with God. Then there's Saudi Arabia, home of Islam's holiest sites, and also one of the world's most aggressive exporters of Wahhabi Islam, a strict ultra-conservative interpretation of the religion. For decades, the Saudi government pumped billions of dollars into building mosques, schools, and charities across Africa, Asia, and even the West. But these weren't just acts of generosity. These were ideological investments. Preachers trained in Saudi seminaries began spreading a version of Islam that left no room for tolerance, that demonized Shia Muslims, Christians, Jews, and anyone seen as innovators. And behind it all, a geopolitical strategy. Use religion to gain influence. And while they exported Wahhabism abroad, they enforced it brutally at home, flogging dissidents, executing apostates, silencing women, and crushing reformers. Yet the West rarely said a word. Why? Because oil talks and arms deals scream. But the West wasn't done playing both sides. While governments like the US declared a global war on terror, they continued allying with regimes that funded the very ideology they claimed to fight. It's not conspiracy. It's just inconvenient truth. Even ISIS, supposedly everyone's enemy, benefited from mysteriously untouched oil routes, black market arms, and suspicious levels of organization for a group formed in a war zone. Documents leaked in recent years suggest that some intelligence agencies knew far more than they admitted, and in some cases turned a blind eye because chaos in the Middle East keeps certain markets alive. Weapons, oil, reconstruction, contracts. Peace doesn't pay, but war does. Meanwhile, in Pakistan, the intelligence agency ISI has long played a double game, publicly denouncing terrorism while secretly sheltering jihadist groups to maintain influence in Afghanistan and Kashmir. They even hid Osama bin Laden in a compound just miles from a military academy for years. The message was clear. Terrorists are pawns, expendable but useful. But perhaps the most chilling twist is this. Sometimes terrorism is manufactured. False flags, staged attacks, entire villages bombed and then blamed on Islamists, not by the terrorists, but by governments looking to justify new laws, silence dissent, or distract the public. A few verses quoted out of context, a body dumped in the street, a staged confession. Suddenly, the news is screaming about a Muslim threat. And overnight, civil liberties vanish. We've seen this tactic in China, where millions of Uyghur Muslims have been detained in camps under the pretense of counter-extremism. But reports show they're not extremists at all. They're students, farmers, poets. And yet, they're being tortured, sterilized, and brainwashed. Because fear of Islam justifies anything now, even genocide. So here's the reality. Yes, some radicals twist the Qur'an to justify bloodshed, but just as dangerously, politicians and governments twist Islam to justify control. They manufacture enemies, they exploit ignorance, they drip-feed hatred into the minds of the desperate, and then step back to watch the explosion. And when the smoke clears, the story is already written, another terrorist attack by Islamic extremists. No one ever asks, who armed them? Who trained them? Who benefits from their chaos? Because in a world where religion is weaponized, the most powerful terrorists might not carry Qur'ans. They carry briefcases. So where do we go from here? We must separate Islam from the cancer of extremism, just like we separate Christianity from the Crusades, or Buddhism from genocidal monks in Myanmar. The religion is not the crime. The twisting of it is. In the end, this isn't just about Muslims or Christians or any single religion. It's about all of us. Because every time someone kills in God's name, and every time someone hates in response, another wall rises. Another child is taught fear instead of love. Another belief is weaponized. And with that, we've come to the end of this video. If you found this video disturbing, eye-opening, or necessary, subscribe to this channel. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below, because more shocking truths about religion's darkest corners are coming.